Morning team, how are you doing? Trust you're all keeping well. If you haven't already caught it, we filmed a Moreton farm update, so you can catch that on the Google Classroom, the college Facebook page, or on YouTube as well. I think I uploaded it up there as well. So today I thought I'd get out and about a bit. Tried it last week, it didn't really work too well, so I thought I'd give it another bash this week. Make it slightly more interesting than me sat in my kitchen just talking to you about things. And as today is going to be on soil, I thought I may as well get out into the field so we can have a look at it, discuss it, and then you know what you're going to be writing for the report you'll be doing later. So what we're going to have a look at today is our different soil types. So we have our clay soils, which are smallest particles, moving up through silt, sandy, and we've also got organic soils as well. So what I'm going to do today is move around college fields, have a look at what different soil types we've got, what that means to us, what decision making that impacts for Henry as the farm manager, and how we overcome potential problems, and how we can also maximise the efficiency of the soils that we've got. So let's move on to the first field. That's going to be Holbrook, which is just in front of me behind the hedge, and we'll have a look at our clay soils. Okay, into our first field. This is Holbrook, so we're at the top of campus now. So if you come out of the top of the college drive, turning left down, you can see the village behind me. And we've come in here because this is our heaviest field we've got on the college site. This is our blue clay. So what does clay actually mean? What is clay soil? Our clay soils are the smallest particles that we have. Each little lump of clay that you find is made up of thousands and thousands of little particles of clay, and that's what makes it so dense. It means you can squeeze it together. And that's what makes it also watertight as well. When you think about bricks, pots and such like, that's why it can be very, very useful. But what does it mean to us as farmers? So clays have positives and negatives. They can hold water really well, so when it comes into the summer, we get bright sunshine, lots of heat. Our lighter soils will start to lose moisture, they'll start to dry out very, very quickly. That can have an impact on our crops. But our clay soils, they hold on to the moisture much more. And with that, means they also hold nutrients as well, because the nutrients are stored in the water. So as the water evaporates in our lighter soils, it gets held in our clay soils much more. So this can benefit us in the summer, if we get a very droughty year. The downside, as you'll be aware, over the last 6 or 7 months, we've had nothing but really rain, which has stopped us putting any winter crops in, stopped us putting any spring crops in. And this is where the downside of clay soils come in. This is because they hold the moisture really well, and it doesn't really drain away. So when we have lots of water, it goes very boggy very quickly and stays like that for a long time. It takes a long time for it to dry out. So we've missed our cropping window for this year. But that's part of farming, unfortunately. We're at the lap of the gods when it comes to the weather. There's only so much we can do about it. So, how can you tell we've got clay soils in the field? If I dig up a little bit, if you mould it in your hand, it should all stick together. It's all pliable, a bit like a putty. That's the first sign of clay. If you put your finger in it, you leave a thumbprint. So that's an obvious sign we've got clay here. Equally a good sign, when it gets really hot in clay soils, the top of it will start to cook. So as you move around the field, you'll see the top of it starting to crack and crumble. That's because it's almost baking on top. So if you're walking through a field, for instance if you're out and about over the next couple of weeks, have a look at the ground. If the ground's beginning to crack and open quite significantly, then there's a good chance that there's an element of clay in the field that you're walking through. So, another potential positive, negative of clay is our cultivations. What we have to consider when actually turning this soil over to create a seedbed for our crops. Because it's much denser than our lighter, sandier soils, we also know it as heavy ground because of that. It takes a lot more to turn it over to actually work our machinery through it. So, for instance, our ploughs, our cultivators and stuff have to work harder, so does our tractor to actually pull large metal implements through this ground because it's so much denser. So our wearing parts on our machinery, they'll have to be replaced more often. There's a potential for increased fuel usage as you're having to work the machines harder to actually pull the implements through the ground. Equally with clay, if I turn this bit over and actually have a feel, it's actually quite cold to the touch. And that's because it takes a long time to warm up. And we know plants need heat to grow. Our soil temperature needs to be above a certain point, usually between 5 and 8 degrees C, for germination to actually take place. So, where our lighter ground will warm up quicker, clay takes a long time for the sun to penetrate it and get that temperature in. So our crops are usually slightly later in germinating this in clayey ground, which can be a positive, can be negative. It can have no real impact at all as long as you know that it's going to happen. If it comes as a surprise to you, then you haven't really done your checks first. You just whack some seed in the field and hope for the best. You should really know what kind of soil you're going into before you start drilling anything anyway. So it shouldn't be a surprise to you. Equally, as I said before, it takes longer to warm up, but there is that added moisture in there as well. So your grass or your cereal crop might take longer to germinate, and your next door neighbour on lighter soil might have a bumper crop by the time yours is coming through. But if you suddenly get droughty conditions in the summer, you're going to be the one that's laughing, because your clayier soils are going to hold on to that moisture a little bit longer and allow for that extended growing period. So there's pros and cons on everything. Right, so that's our clay soils. Next one we're going to move on to is our silty, our medium soils. Right then folks, field number 2. So we're now into reservoir field. So we've got the entrance to the college just over there behind me. And we're going to discuss silty soil in here. So silty soil sits in the middle of our soil groups. It's what we call our intermediate particle size. So we've got our very, very small particles in our clay field behind the hedge in front of me in Holbrook, and we've got larger sandy particles in the aptly named sandy ground, which is behind over my shoulder, which we'll wander over to in a minute. So what do we need to know about our silty soil? Silty soil kind of sits in the middle of the rules as well as being our intermediate particle size, so it's slightly more free draining than our clay soils. Our particles are a little bit bigger, so the moisture can move a little bit faster. That also means the sun can penetrate it a little bit more, so it warms up faster in summer, sorry, not winter. So it does have its benefits. It still has properties similar to clay. You can still squeeze it together in your hand. It just doesn't mould quite as well. You can still see there's individual lumps and bits and pieces in there. It's not quite as malleable as clay, but you can still see that particles are quite small. And that leads me on to something that we discussed, well, we should have discussed really in Holbrook, and that's compaction. Compaction can be a problem for clay and silty soils as well. And compaction is when we're moving large machinery over the ground. You'll see it particularly in our tram lines and such like, where our wheel lines are going through. We've got a lot of weight, and all it's doing is, as you're driving over it, it's pushing all this soil together and compacting it up. So what we get essentially is a compacted pan here, and it goes really, really flat, really, really hard, and essentially almost can become watertight in very heavy clay soils. So water can't really penetrate through that. It also becomes very hard for seeds as well if they're below, to try and force their way through. It can become quite solid, so it can have problems with germination, nutrient transfer as well. Roots have to try and force their way through this and can struggle, so they can't get to the nutrients below. So it can have an impact on establishment, it can have an impact on overall yield. So it's quite a big problem. We're going to have a discussion later on in a week or so's time about how we're going to overcome that problem. So it's something to be aware of when in your report, when we're discussing our clays and our silty soils, that compaction can be an issue. So that's our silty soils, our middle ground. I'm going to move over to sandy ground pretty quickly, because that's going to give you a better scope as to what rules apply to this, because we can see both ends of the spectrum, and this silty soil kind of sits in the middle. Okay, into field number 3. So we're now into the aptly named sandy ground, and this is right above me. If you walk directly to my left, you come to the entrance of the college, so we're across the road. And this is our sandiest ground we've got on college, hence why we named it. And sandy soils is the exact opposite end of the spectrum to our clay, so it's our largest particle we can get. You've all been to the beach, you've all seen sand, you can see each individual grain. And you can see it in here as well. Now that means two things. If you've got large particles bumped together, there's gaps. That means our moisture can move through it very, very quickly. And this is why you'll often hear sandy soil be referred to as hungry soil. This is because the moisture moves away from it very, very quickly. With the moisture, it can take nutrients. So we need to be very careful with, when managing these soils. They can work really well for us, but we need to know how to manage them. So we need to be aware that we are on sandy ground, so we can calculate our fertiliser rates appropriately. So if we don't put enough on and it suddenly becomes dry, all the nutrients will soak away with the water, and our poor crops are going to suffer. They won't be able to grow, we're not going to get the yield, you're not going to get the profit at the end of harvest. So it's going to have a massive impact if we don't get that right. So we need to be aware that we're on sandy ground so we can get the right amount of nutrients into that soil so we can grow a decent yielding crop. Equally, it's the opposite of what clay does. So this heats up really, really quickly in spring. Nice big gaps between the particles, sun can penetrate through, warm those soil up, so we get really early germination on here. So if we're grazing animals, for instance, we've got a dairy farm on light ground, we can turn them out onto pasture earlier than those on clay ground. One, it dries up so the cows can actually walk on it without trashing the ground, and two, the grass will have germinated and started growing a little bit quicker than on maybe next door on clay soils. So the lighter soil you've got, the earlier turnout you can be able to do with your livestock, the less poaching and damage they'll do to the soil. So it can work really well, but we need to manage it in the summer. This is where the problem comes. We get something called summer burn-off. And that's if we've grazed, especially if we've grazed grass, with sheep especially, they graze it down very tight, they're nibbly eaters and can take it down quite low. Sun can penetrate the soil and just burn the grass off. So we don't have any crops left, so we have to be very careful with our sandy soil because it can suffer from burn off really, really harshly. Our clay soils, they hold on to that moisture a little bit longer, they stay a little bit cooler, so the summer burn off isn't as much of an issue to them. So that's something we need to consider with our sandy soils. Equally, compaction isn't so bad because they're larger particles. If I pick a bit up and come a bit closer, you'll be able to see it. They just crumble up. Try and squeeze it together like clay, it just doesn't happen. So we don't get that compaction, which is beneficial. Equally, as we were discussing before with our larger machinery going through on our clay fields, as they pass through, it takes them a lot more work to drag themselves through this denser soil. This is quite light and easy. It's easy ground to work. You don't need the heavier kit. You don't need to go as deep to break up the soil. So less groundworks are required, so it can be a cheaper soil to farm. Not always, there are exceptions to every rule, but you might be able to get away with minimal tillage, direct drilling, just enough to create a seed bed on top. So there's pros and cons to both of them, and it's just how we manage them and how we maximise our profits from them. And that's part of the challenges of farming. So that's our sandy soils. Our next ones are going to be our loams, so our mixtures. Second reservoir field again is our loams. And if truth be told, all of our soils on the college site are a loam. The majority of soils you'll find are. And a loam is a mixture. It's very rare that you'll find pure clay or pure sand. A pure sand field is called a beach, in my opinion. So you're going to have a mixture of it, and these are called loams. And depending on what we find in our loam is what we call it. So, for instance, if we have a clay loam, which is what we find the most of in our college site, it's a mixture of still clay, silt and sand, but the main ingredient is our clay, so we call it a clay loam. And our loams are realistically the best kind of soils. We don't just want clay, we don't just want silt or sand, we want a mixture, because then what we'll find is we get the best of all the worlds really. We've got the slightly more free draining bit of the sand, but we've got some of the clay in there that's going to hold on to a bit of moisture, so it's not going to dry out as quickly. that clay is also going to hold on to the nutrients a bit more than just the sand. But the sand will also let a bit of water drain away, so when we do get wet weather come in, it drains away slightly quicker. So having a combination of it works really, really well, and it's our most useful soils we can get is our loams. So we don't really want one type or the other, we want a mixture, because a mixture is the best. So as I said, we're predominantly a clay loam around here, very, very clay loam in the fields just in front of me, Holbrook, which we were in before. And the way it kind of works, because up here at the top of campus, apart from Holbrook, which is quite a dense blue clay, we're on quite a light ground here. Sandy ground we'd probably put into as a sandy loam. Here in Reservoir we'd put maybe a silty loam, just this kind of silty clay loam. It'd be tricky to decipher between the two. And then as we move down, so we're slightly lighter up here, and as we move down towards the farm through campus, the ground becomes heavier and we're sitting on quite a dense clay loam again. So Holbrook here is a kind of the exception to the rule around this bit. It's a lot lighter than we are. We're on the top of a hill really, we're going down towards the farm. At the bottom of the hill is much denser, heavier, clayey ground, so that's our clay loams. So the impact of that is we've got different bits to work with, so there's different challenges for Henry to face, and he has to know that up here at the top of campus is going to behave slightly differently to down at the bottom. So that's pretty much from me today. So what we're going to do, I've launched some work on the Google Classroom. What you can do is be writing a report about our different soil types, telling about what we're going to find, the characteristics of our clay, our silt, our sand, what impacts that has on us as farmers, and equally where we find that on our college site as well, so relating it always back to here at college. That's what I'd like you to do. Include your images, include your diagrams, make it interesting, because soil is one of the most useful tools we have. If we don't look after it, if we don't have it anymore, we're not going to be doing that much farming, especially not out here anyway. So any questions, drop me emails, and we'll go from there. Check out the Google Classroom for the instructions on the report, and I shall see you guys later. Thanks for tuning in.